So now I'm wondering whether this is actually the boys don't cry, or do they episode. Um, that's maybe a weird way to think about it, and it's probably also weird that I'm starting this episode with the what I think is the worst take I've ever heard. But this is Linky Land, so we're just gonna talk about stuff that happens on LinkedIn. Welcome to episode, I believe it's number 8 if I haven't lost count. My name is Tony Albrecht, and this is In Linky Land, a podcast about the power of creating and connecting on LinkedIn. Today, last week, we had a couple just straight up stars in the LinkedIn sales space, Salman and Darren. I really enjoyed that conversation, and those two gentlemen are two of my favorite people around here. Today, a couple more men in the sales space. The one is farther removed at this point, but today we're getting into mental health, and specifically men and mental health and the challenges and I say me, this is certainly something I've run into in my own journey and struggles with alcoholism and just wrestling with ideas of what it means to be a man, what it means to be successful, what it means to be a professional. Today, I'm talking to Jaleel Mackey and Tim Perreira, two men who've spent sizable chunks of their career in the tech sales space with a number of different companies. Both of them have bounced around a little bit, including with companies you most certainly have heard of, and you can check out their resumes on LinkedIn, of course. Profiles are in the show notes. But Tim is out of San Diego at this point and runs Per Wellness, his company aimed at helping men talk about struggles with mental health and get healthier. Jaleel Mackey is out of Aptos, California, up north, and he's the founder of Breathe, Rise, and Thrive, and is also with a startup called Modern Health. And Jaleel's, one of his lines that I love is mental health is health. He's an evangelist for that. And he's been one of my favorite people to watch for how open he is about his own struggles with mental health issues and with alcohol abuse. We have some similarities in our stories in that respect. But both these guys, the reason I wanted to have this conversation is because LinkedIn historically has this sense of, well, it's not a sense, it's a professional networking site, right? And it brings a lot of connotations and baggage in terms of what professional means. And Tim and Jaleel are two men who are very overtly turning that conventional understanding of what professional means on its head in ways that personally I think are extremely healthy and exciting. They really are blazing new trails for what it means to be a professional man, in ways that I think are going to help create more and more men who are coming to professionalism, coming to their careers, coming to the ideas of success and what it means to be a provider, what it means to be, frankly, a man in the 21st century, and do it in a better way. We cover some meaty ground in this episode, including our relative struggles with mental health, including a lot of issues around repression and feeling like we aren't able to talk about certain things. Then we get into how they think about their own journeys from sort of chaos to relative health, and then also how they're helping other people to learn more about those things for themselves. Tim had to duck off at one point. Jaleel and I kept rolling for a bit longer. I wanted to unpack his journey as a side hustler in some details. I like what he's doing, and he's iterating a lot, and he's throwing a lot of stuff out there. And I know there are a lot of people who think about starting side hustles or passion projects and seeing if they can build something out of those. And frankly, I think we need as much of that as we can get. And a big part of that is learning kind of what that process looks like, which is to say a whole lot of iteration and a whole lot of stuff that isn't going to work all that well. So the more we can show up and do the work and start to build a body of work and learn what works and learn, more importantly, what doesn't work, the better off we're going to be to find our own way in the creator economy. So links to these gentlemen and their projects can be found in the show notes. That's enough out of me. Let's get to the conversation with Jaleel Mackey and Tim Perreira. Tim, Jaleel, thank you for joining me for this conversation. Typically on this podcast, I lead with our relative stories about LinkedIn, since this is a podcast about LinkedIn. I want to try something a little different today because the two of you gentlemen are really inspirational voices talking about the importance of mental health for men, a topic that needs as much attention as it can get, frankly. So instead of starting with the typical flow of how did LinkedIn open up for you in a new way, I'm gonna frame our conversation from the outset with a LinkedIn post, appropriately so, which I actually posted about this last week, 2 weeks ago, as maybe the worst take I have ever seen on LinkedIn. So I'm gonna drop this on you as the framing for what we're talking about today. Right. The worst thing about the crying CEO, the crying in public. Men don't cry, period. And if they have to, they do it privately, keep it to themselves. It's our role to lead the family, the business, the clan. You need to be strong, even if you don't feel like it. You won't always live up to the high standard, but it's an ideal worth holding up. So stop sniveling like a little boy and grow a pair. Gentlemen, welcome to In Linky Land.
Thanks for having us. We're excited to be here, Tony. For real.
It's good to be here, Tony.
Yeah,
you came with a heavy hitter. I love it.
Yeah, for sure. And that gentleman he tends to be a pretty thoughtful dude. He's going to remain nameless here to protect the innocent and the guilty. But I see that. I mean, that take is getting less in vogue, I would think, or less predominant, I think. But it struck me as a real throwback that if we're talking 20 years ago or 50 years ago or 80 years ago, that is the predominant view, in a way that there probably isn't much of an alternative. And so I just thought of it as a relevant way of framing what has been the predominant narrative on what men are supposed to be, and really what you two are voices for or pushing back against out here. So with that in mind, let's start with let's say the stories of how each of you, and I know you both have spent a number of years in sales, specifically in tech sales for the most part. And you both have really strong stories of things going well, things falling apart, and then how you've put things back together. And frankly, I just would like to start there with what those stories have looked like for the two of you. So, Jaleel, would you mind telling us your deepest, darkest secrets?
Happy to. I don't have many secrets anymore. It's an interesting way to live. Goodness, yeah. First of all, I'm just feeling grateful to be here. Truly, I think this is it's a beautiful opportunity to talk about something that is on a lot of people's minds, but I think not having enough spaces or safe spaces to even explore it is, I think, the challenge that we face today. And so I think that's like the crux really of my own personal story is, I spent most of my young adult into, even teenage into young adult life, really just trying to pursue this idea of what it meant to be a man. Highly successful, making a lot of money, really, and underneath it all was just trying to prove to myself and the world that I was worthy of existence and that I was worthy of being seen, right? Worthy of love, worthy of being told I'm doing a good job. And I've always been this high performer where like, I don't believe that I'm deserving of attention or love or affection or any sort of like attaboy unless I'm actually overachieving. And that carried me for a piece of my life until eventually it didn't. And, you mentioned that I was, tech sales for several years and I ended up getting married. I had a kid and I was using the kid in the marriage as like a way of kind of proving to the world, like, look how functional I am, right? Look how good of a person I am in the world. Like I have a beautiful family. Look at how wonderful we are, right? Like, I got a great job. I got a good car. I've got, we're doing international trips and like I can afford to put my son in preschool and pay for it. And like all of these things were ways for me to say, hey, look at me. I'm a functioning, strong man in the world. And then at some point I moved my family from California to New York City. And in the pursuit of more, I've been very open and transparent about my experience with alcohol and my my participation in the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. And like my story very much so mirrors that of Bill's, where I was chasing more money, more prestige, looking for more accolades, bringing my family to New York, trying to find that extra pay bump and that title and that recognition. And it was there that I crashed and burned, right? Where I was no longer in the container of support that I had created for myself in California. I didn't have anything to distract me. New York City in itself is a crucible, especially if you are running away from some deep, unresolved trauma and pain and uncertainty of self. So, I'll give you the Cliff Notes version of this, which is I ended up checking myself into a treatment facility. It got pretty ugly, suicidal ideation. Figured if I don't do something, I'm going to die. I realized in that moment I didn't want to die, but it was in that place when I was in a room full of a bunch of strange men that I'd never met before in this facility in Florida, Delray Beach, Florida, where I had that safe space to finally tell people about the things that I was carrying. And people looked at me and said, oh yeah, man, me too. Oh yeah, I've been there. Yeah, I know that feeling. And I was like, holy shit, I'm getting chills just thinking about it. Holy shit, like, what do you mean you've been here before? Like I am only me. I'm the only one that feels this pain. I'm the only one that suffers in this life. I'm the only one that has experienced these things. How can you tell me too? And there was like utter disbelief followed by relief. And that relief, I think, is what I'm hoping to create for folks, right? I think that's the piece that inspires me mostly, is this idea that when I heard that, oh yeah, man, me too, like, hey, you're not alone there. It opened up something for me where I stopped feeling like I had to pretend to be somebody that I wasn't. And now I step into the world with this almost like openness of saying, hey, look, I know there's plenty of people out here who've experienced this. I discovered it in a treatment facility with a bunch of random men from a bunch of different walks of life and various economic statuses and skin colors and everything. And like, there was the common denominator here was that we all had emotions and we all experienced emotional realities that we didn't know how to tend to, And I'll pause there and then we'll keep riffing.
Oh, that's great stuff. And Jaleel, that I also had the benefit of Alcoholics Anonymous and getting a grip on my relationship to alcohol. And frankly, you know, I write and talk publicly about my Guamanian jail cell moment in 2009. We're coming up on the 13-year anniversary of that illustrious event, when I regained consciousness on a concrete slab. And that experience of, you know, by the time I got to my bottom, I was the center of the universe, right? And the world was nothing more than the supporting cast and the backdrop for the movie of my life, right? And so that experience you're referring to of, well, wait, I'm not special. Oh, you mean like all these amazing feats and Herculean challenges aren't, oh, I'm just like the rest of these drunks. We're all just idiots trying to figure out how not to die or go to jail. So liberating. And Tim, having heard a little bit of your story in the research for this pod, I know you've got, you know, Jaleel talked about what I call a geographic cure at this point. I had that, you know, Guam was supposed to be a geographic cure for me. It didn't work out very well. I know you've got some of that in your story as well. But that element he's talking about of sharing your story and then having somebody say, oh yeah, I know that, or like, I really appreciate your putting that out there, because it sounds like my story. From what I've heard about you, your experience of that actually came in public, like through social media. So yeah, fill us in on your experience of kind of hitting your, let's say, mental health rock bottom.
Yeah, man. Well, I think the path is interesting. I was an athlete through college, you know, growing up. So really competitive, you know, in a team. I played baseball through school. So always somebody who was like, I got to get better. You know, I got to be my best. I got to be a leader on the team. I got to, you know, look to improve. I got to be in shape. I got to be, you know, all of these things. And so when sports ended, I think a lot of people experience this transitioning from sports, whether it's professional or collegiate or even, you know, high level high school. And it's like, what the heck do I do after? And so for me, it was a few years of spinning my wheels to be like, how do I transfer this competitive drive and this really desire to be great at something in life? And how do I do that in the corporate world? So I ended up getting into sales, and I kind of found my footing. It found like something I was good at, you know, something I could be good at. Like the more not necessarily effort, but like hard work I put in, more strategy I had behind it, I could improve, I could get better, I could, you know, move up the stack rankings, I could make more money, it was a very clear path for me. It made sense. And that was after spending 10 months in a call center, just answering calls all day, helping people with their mortgage, and realizing, I'm like, what the hell am I doing? I could crush everybody in this office in terms of stats, and I'm getting paid the same. So that was kind of the transition. And then, so fast forward, I was in sales for about 7 or 8 years. And I went through the path I think a lot of people go through, where they, you know, they bust their tail, they get promoted. They're thinking, hey, once I get to that AE level, once I get, you know, that good territory, like, yeah, I'll be super fulfilled, or I'll have made it. Once I get that bump to the next, you know, that pay bump. And then you get there, and of course, you know, a month later, your gaze changes and you start looking up, you know, next to the next position. And so that kept happening for years. And I had done, you know, I think back, I got MVP of sales one year. That was my goal all year, and I hit it. And I was like, okay, well, now what? And I got promoted to go into a manager role, which I was, again, stoked. And I'm bringing all these things up to be like, this is what was most important for me in my life at the time, was I was setting these goals and really doing everything I could to, in hindsight, realizing like, man, I was just trying to prove to myself that I was worth something, that I, you know, could contribute to the company or society or people in my life, to make money, to be able to provide for family or people in my life. I wanted to have a family someday. I was like, man, yeah, I do this, then I'll be able to have a house, then I'll be able to get this new car, then I'll be able to, invest, and like, yeah, then I'll be set, then I'll start to be successful. And that's really what I want in life. So that was the train of thought that was running in the background. And I ended up breaking up with a girlfriend of mine, a long-term girlfriend of about 4 years. And I ended up moving across the country also to New York City, which is funny how Jaleel did. And, at a really tough time in my life. I mean, I was about to move in with her. Things were, we're thinking long term, and we broke up. And then just weeks later, I ended up moving across the country. So also kind of cut the cord from my whole support system, 3,000 miles away from anybody I knew. I was, alone there. And that's when things really started to not feel right. And so I started to struggle with like, man, I can't figure this out. I don't know what's going on. I don't know why I feel not as good as I was feeling before, and it started to manifest in different ways. I would go out and drink more on the weekends, or I would, get terrible sleep, or I started having less motivation to wake up early and go to the gym. So that's kind of how it started to show itself early on. And then what happened was I was chasing this feeling of, okay, well, it must be the city I'm in. It must be the job I'm in. So what did I do? I moved to Chicago. I changed jobs. And then I'm in Chicago and the feeling comes up again. So what do? I quit my job. I change jobs and I move, to a different neighborhood. And so that happened a ton. I moved 16 times in 12 years. I moved across country 3 times. I changed cities 4 times in 4 years, like major cities. And as you could probably imagine, none of that solved it. And also at the same time, what started to happen is my production in my career really started to slip after I, reached the I would say the pinnacle, at least at that point, of getting MVP, reaching President's Club, getting a great promotion. After that, I just really started to slip. I was like, okay, well, if that didn't bring me the feelings that I thought it was going to bring, then why even, show up and try my best and whatnot and work. So I really started to go through low points, but starting in New York. So about 4 years of depression, some ups and downs, mostly downs, right? A lot of being really frustrated. I couldn't figure it out. Being also frustrated that I had nobody to talk to about it. I was somebody, again, college athlete, was a leader in the organization, had performed well. Like, I'm supposed to have my shit together. I'm supposed to be able to figure it out. I'm not a figure within the company or someone within the company who is supposed to be struggling. My friends and family are on the other side of the country. Wasn't about to call them up and tell them I was struggling. I didn't want them to worry about me. Embarrassed to get help, to be like, man, I'm supposed to have my shit together right now. I'm making great money. I'm living in the coolest city in the world. And things are not only not right, they are slipping quickly and they're going downhill. And then I was fired a few months into the pandemic. Sales performance was slipping. I ended up just missing quota. They put me on a performance plan, and I just was like, screw this. I've been doing everything right in work. Obviously, this isn't working. They put me on a plan, and I'm like, I can't do this anymore. And I ended up getting fired a couple months later, and it all kind of came to a head. And so for me, I still hadn't told anybody I was struggling. There was a point I did try and see a psychiatrist when I was in Chicago, and that experience didn't go well. I share about that experience too, when they tried to get me on meds immediately. But I had this, it was about 2 years ago to the day almost, when things really started to turn around. So after I was fired, I heard this idea that everything in our life, all the events that happen to us, are neutral, objectively neutral. All meaning, good or bad, comes from within our own mind. Like, it just has to do with our beliefs, our perspective, our thoughts. And things just really clicked. It made me realize that all of these struggles I had had the last few years, the reason I was changing cities so much, the reason I was looking for fulfillment and happiness, or whatever the term, success outside of me was, or the reason I was doing all those is because I didn't understand that I was actually the reason I wasn't feeling that way. So this idea that I heard, this quote that I heard, just was kind of an epiphany. And it at least gave me a clear path forward, where I was like, oh my gosh, I've been the one constant in this whole thing. And so through the next few months, and I was like, man, I got to do everything I can to somehow change my beliefs, somehow change my perspective, somehow change like whatever I think about my life. And through that process, I turned the corner on depression, and I just like, I had clarity, I had a sense of direction. And so to get to your point, I shared on Instagram. I was finally at a, I had never told anybody, still to this point, had never shared anything. And I was like, I just had this feeling I should share on Instagram. I got a ton of responses from guys that were like, man, I'm going through the same thing. Or like, I felt like you wrote that for me. And then because of those responses, I turned to LinkedIn, and I was like, screw it. I'm just going to post this on LinkedIn. I just I don't care anymore. I'm not worried about judgment. I think if this can help somebody, it's worth it. And the same thing happened. And so that's kind of what started the whole posting on LinkedIn and posting on social media about it. But it was, I think, to Jaleel's point, when he was saying just being able to sit there and have people see him and understand him and know what he's going through, I started to feel that just with posts and the comments I was getting and the messages. And I started having calls with guys, and the amount of guys I had that would sit across from me in a Zoom call and say, you're the first person I've ever told this to, was blowing my mind. You know, I'm like, you don't understand. Like, this was me like a couple of years ago. You wouldn't, I wasn't so open about it. I didn't talk about it. So it was just incredible. So I saw the opportunity to really lean into it and hopefully be, the voice to just kind of take the first step and be like, look, this stuff happens to everybody, and it's really not a big deal. So it ends up being a big deal if you don't do anything about it, but there's a path forward.
That that the idea that it isn't a big deal is one that I would imagine is pretty evocative. And maybe like when we're in it, it feels like it's not only a big deal, it's the only deal, right?
Yeah.
That I did find for myself with alcoholism, I started talking about my problems pretty early on after I sort of got my spiritual house in order. And my thinking on that, coming out of a tradition where anonymity is part of the deal, right? Is if you tell people you're an alcoholic, you run the risk of being ostracized, fired, shunned. Like for me, there was, number one, the more people know that this is a deal for me, the more people who will be on the lookout for signs that I'm not behaving myself. But then also, and I know this is something both of you guys have thought about a lot, is stigma. Is the fact that my brain doesn't process alcohol the same way that normal people's brains do isn't actually a bad, it's just a thing. To your point, Tim, it's a neutral thing. It's a thing. And as long as I'm aware of that and conducting myself in alignment with that reality, I can actually be a pretty decent guy from time to time. Like I can do okay. If I don't live in accordance with that reality, there will be consequences. But like the thing in and of itself, I really like how you zeroed in on that. And that idea, Buddhist philosophy, Taoist philosophy have been really important for me in terms of how I've gotten healthy and stayed healthy for the last 12 years. And yeah, Jaleel with Breathe, Rise, and Thrive, I know you've that probably aligns with where you're coming from, yeah? The mindfulness aspect.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I think you mentioned getting your spiritual house in order in AA, and I love that concept, and the way I kind of experienced it as well was, before I jump into this, there's one thing that came to mind as you were sharing, Tim, which was this, there's a book by John Kabat-Zinn, I think it's called Wherever You Go, There You Are, right? And that notion of like you moving to all those different places over that period of time, like it reminded me of that note of that story, right? Of like, we can try to change all of the context. And I think this ties in really well to Buddhism and the philosophies that I've kind of found myself really cultivating. You can move and change the context of your external world all you want, but at the end of the day, the true work, the real work happens internally. It's always an inside job. Always an inside job. It doesn't matter what job you have, what relationship you have, how much money you have. It's always an inside job. And there's something I don't know, in my experience, and I'm curious, what the two of you think, but and I will answer your question, Tony. Um, I am curious, it feels to me almost incredibly liberating for that to be true, but also terrifying because there's a level of like accountability that takes place where I can bullshit everybody around me. And I can even try to bullshit myself, right? But like I'm the only person that can really know, am I doing the inner work here? And so like to tie that into the Buddhist question that you asked, Tony, is in Eastern philosophies, like when I was in Florida, I found a local yoga studio that was kind of a part of the lineage of Yogananda. And I had, before leaving New York City, had like watched the autobiography of a yogi, like the documentary version. I also started reading the book, and then I found myself in this treatment facility where we're doing yoga every morning, 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. And then I learned that the yoga practices that they're teaching me are Kriya yoga practices, which are the yoga practices of Yogananda. And I'm like, oh, that's kind of crazy. Like, tell me more about this. I literally was just studying this person before I came down here. And then once I was kind of stepped down, they had different levels, right? It was partial hospitalization. So I was living in a home that was part of the facility, and they would drive me from the home to the facility every day. And then when I stepped down, I was living in a halfway house. And the context of the halfway house is recovering addicts of various kinds, right? My first roommate was a recovering heroin addict, and I'm having conversations and again connecting with people. This is just like the powerful thing that I was discovering was like, hey, we're all human beings. Like, it doesn't matter the story. I'm not better than, you're not better than me. Like, this whole idea of separateness started to fade away. So tying this into the Buddhist philosophies and the traditions of Eastern philosophies, I'm practicing yoga at this facility, God, 5, 6 days a week. My high performance, wanting to prove myself, my brain was still in full swing, and I jumped into this like advanced yoga teacher training that I did after like not having much of a foundation of yoga, and very much so was trying to prove myself, but still it was in that place of constantly quieting the mind, in that place of discovering the power of the breath, in that place of realizing that this idea of separation is an illusion. This idea of I'm different or special is just kind of fading away. It was the beginning of my, I think really keeping things in orbit. I'd been a mindfulness explorer, if you will, for 13, 14 years at this point, but I never really knew how to hold it in orbit. It was just like, I'm not sure what I'm doing here. It feels like I should be doing this. Sometimes I have moments where I feel like it calms me down, but like other times it's just frustrating, and I couldn't quite really hold it in orbit. But it was in that place where like AA was holding me, teaching me, hey, this is how you clean your shit up, clean up your side of the street, be honest with other men, go through your fourth step, uncover all the ways that you've done shit in the world and harmed people when people have harmed you. And let's be honest with ourselves here. Let's tell somebody about it. And let's go make amends and make sure that we clean up our side of the street and make sure other people know, hey, I know I was being an asshole then. I'm sure you probably felt X, Y, and Z about it. I'm going to live according to this, right? If you'll forgive me, please. If not, that's okay. I understand, right? This idea of living amends. And once I did all of that, I had the space for me personally to be able to explore these other kind of worlds of mindfulness and breath work and yoga and these other spiritual traditions that began to really inform even how I show up professionally. Right? Like today, I'm a sales manager for a tech company, and I teach my team breath work. Like in our team meetings, I'm teaching them breath work classes at the beginning and helping them realize, hey, box breathing is something that's really effective. It'll make you a better performer, right? Understanding the motivations of folks, but it also is a wonderful way to down regulate your nervous system and calm you down so that when you're in the middle of a really intense conversation, you're not reacting to that, right? You're choosing to respond. Another Buddhist tradition, the stimulus and the response, right? There's infinite space. And so I'm teaching these things because they're now just a part of how I show up every day. It's how I parent. It's how I lead. It's how I run a business. It's how I post on LinkedIn. It's the classes I'm teaching. I'm in the middle of a what the fuck is mindfulness course that wraps up tonight, right? Like all of these things are just like a part of me now. And I think that's the beauty of it. It becomes integrated. It becomes an integrated experience. And And this is the last thing I'll share, which is the integration comes after I stopped trying to do all the time. Like instead of just trying to do and prove and focus on the external world, I began to think about being more often. Like, where do I want to emanate from? I want to emanate from a place of peace. I want to emanate from a place of contentment, of gratitude. I want to emanate from this place of connection with other people and believing that I'm not better than, different from, but that we are all part of the same soup of living human beings that swim in the same air that we literally breathe constantly together. Like we're connected in so many ways. And when I emanate from that place, I'm being this person of peace, and I'm being this person of understanding and empathy and all of that. And the way that I do is not from this place of lack, it's from this place of fulfillment. And it becomes just a natural way to show up in the world. Nothing to prove. I have nothing to prove, you know.
That happiness is an inside job. I mean, you just riffed on that then for a few minutes, and it all resonates so much with me. And where you got to in terms of saying that how you show up with your team in your tech sales role now is a reflection, you know, the macrocosm reflects the microcosm, right? That you've actually found a way for that center that you've found and that you're working to maintain. You've actually found a way that your professional presence can, I don't know if seamlessly is the right word, but can effectively integrate with that. And as we're talking here, you know, ideas of success and professionalism are woven into these stories we're talking about, where it seems like the industrial society gave us such clear ideas of what success looked like. And I've got my own version of the story you gentlemen are describing. It's like getting to the point where you've jumped through all the hoops, you got all the stuff, and then you look around and is this it? And the answer is no. Not only is this not it, but you've been chasing the wrong shit. Right. And how many movies and books and TV shows do we need to see, you know, before we, and frankly, people in our own lives, we watch struggle before we say, oh, that's real. That's real that we've been chasing the wrong shit. And it strikes me, and part of why I was excited to have this conversation with the two of you, men who are coming from, I mean, it's a pretty bro-ish culture, right? And tech sales and a lot of machismo and a lot of striving, right? And how in this moment, you know, where the industrial age is giving way to whatever the hell it is we're occupying now, the connection economy, the creator economy, the internet age, you're both really inspiring examples of how we can leverage what's happening with the internet. And you know, both of you are using LinkedIn as an avenue for building your wellness related businesses. But I find that really powerful that you are finding the ways to start from the center, as you're saying, Jaleel, and then go into the world in a way that, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, we're redefining what professional looks like, right? Where Jaleel with, you know, the flowing locks, and, you know, you're a person of color, and you're coming in here talking all this hippie bullshit, you know, like that wouldn't have flown 20 years ago even, right? But now obviously I'm here for it, right? And other people are here, right? Like society is coming around to being here for it in a way that strikes me as, I mean, certainly encouraging as for where we're going. But I'll jujitsu that into, well, do I need to jujitsu that into a question, Tim? Are you still a blue belt? I
was gonna say I haven't heard that as a verb before,
no?
so I wanted to hear what that. No,
it's just
love it though.
Gracefully channeling the force, and the, you know, that's my jiu-jitsu career lasted about 6 months before I got, like, we were practicing arm bars, and this new gentleman who had about 30 pounds on me,
Always the new guys.
he was really excited about the arm bars and arm barred me to the point where elbows aren't supposed to bend that way. And and then I moved and I haven't been back. But anyway,
Okay.
yeah,
It works. See, jiu-jitsu works. That's the thing. So even if you're new, you know, you can still get somebody in an armbar. It's going to hurt.
absolutely. Yeah. Tim, I'm interested in your take on, well, I mean, pretty much everything that Jaleel said there, but this idea of what a new professionalism can look like. And I'd say particularly in the context of what you're building with, is it pronounced Per Wellness?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I think a couple things too that I was, you know, thinking about, that we said earlier, the comment about it not being a big deal, you know, mental health. What I mean by that is it's not a big deal in the sense that it's not unique to you. You know, like it's part of the human experience. And, you know, whether it's mental health or mindset or mental wellness, whatever you want to call it, um, we all as individuals experience the same emotions and feelings. Some of us just suppress them, you know, what I think I did for a long time. There were certain, I tried to pick and choose which emotions, you know, or which feelings that would come up. I don't, that makes me uncomfortable. I don't want to tap into that. And so that's just what I encourage you guys to do. And I got to, I think, this point of vulnerability. I heard this thing that was really interesting to me. And it was the idea that when you express vulnerability, you're no longer vulnerable. And the famous, you know, movie clip I think of is 8 Mile, when Eminem, you know, goes on stage and just shits on himself. The whole round, the guy comes up, he's got nothing to say because he owns it. He knows it. He's not letting it, you know, prevent him from going on stage. He's not letting it define him as a person. And I think it's hard to do. It's hard to, I think, envision yourself in that position, especially when you're first starting out or you're exploring what mental health means for you, or, you know, your spiritual world, or your relationship with yourself, your sense of self, whatever it is, whatever stage of the journey you're in. And I think the power behind that and the power behind vulnerability, especially on a platform like this, is, you know, you can get to this place in your life where you're not resisting anymore. You don't feel shame if you get bummed out, if you get sad, if something doesn't work out. You know, I think there's a difference between feeling sorry for yourself and like you know, self-pity and all this stuff, and just like experiencing feelings of sadness or being bummed. And that's where I was thinking about the post you shared earlier and what the guy sharing. And I think there's clearly room to be both, you know, the idea of this warrior poet, you know, to have this fierce side to you, this provider, protector, but also, you know, have the full spectrum of feelings and emotions and being in tune with them and not shying away from them, you know, and just understanding, again, it's part of the human experience. And the more work I think we can do, and I've seen this with guys I work with in cohorts and, you know, one-on-one and just conversations on LinkedIn, is just giving them the opportunity to accept that, yo, this is just normal. You may not know how to process it yet. You may not know what to do with it, but just allow yourself the opportunity for a moment to not freak out when those feelings come up, and just let them, you know, let them come and go. And it's not going to be the end of the world. So that's what I think I talk about, where it's like, man, it's not that big a deal. You know, you're bummed out, you know, if you're sad about something, if you're scared, if you're terrified that you're not, you know, that you're not going to hit quota and you're going to get fired, or maybe, you know, you finish in the bottom third of your sales org ranking or whatever it is. These are all things that would, you know, kind of freak me out for a while. That's okay to feel those things. Like, man, you're human. It's not, we don't need to make it more than it is. And I think that has just allowed people the opportunity to be like, man, you know, I feel like I've been conditioned to think the opposite of that my whole life. And so just providing a perspective, hopefully, where guys can see, like, you know, I say, like, I'll kind of throw myself on the sword in a way where I'm like, look, I know how I was appearing before, or like my appearance to other people in the company or people on LinkedIn or people I knew in my, social circle. And I'm like, I'll lean into that. I don't care. As someone that appeared that way or had early success or was a college athlete, like, even me, I still was just a wreck at times for years. So it's just, I think sharing on, let's say LinkedIn specifically, has just opened a bit more of a dialogue. And especially in this bro-ish, you know, really grinded out type of culture, for guys to be like, wait a minute, there's actually people doing it a different way. And, people that are, again, are, maybe they look like they have the appearance of being like a man, or they do, manly things or whatever. They're providers, or they train MMA, or they do all the stuff, and wait, and they're still, even these guys still talk about meditation and spirituality, and like not resisting feelings come up, because that's just, a recipe for a disaster down the road, as I've, learned the hard way. So I just, yeah, I had that thought kind of coming through as Jaleel was talking a little bit about how his journey has changed how he shows up in all different areas of his life. And I think creating that space, as much as possible, like even little by little, and I think about in these conversations, just allows people to tap into themselves as a human, where they can show up better at work, show up better in their relationship, with their friendships, and not feel like they have to live up to an image, or find success, or their self-worth starts to not be defined and determined by accomplishments, accolades, outcomes, how much money they make, etc. And just that there is a possibility that there's a different way, I think is pretty freeing for guys.
That's really well said. And that I appreciate what you're drawing out there about that post, and this idea that actually it's not an either or, between either you're being a man and a provider, or you're being somebody who shows emotion. That ultimately what we're certainly three examples of men who believe that embracing our emotions um, is the best way to become a better version of a man, or certainly for me, and a better provider, better husband, better father, better professional. That I've got a candle tattooed on my bicep as a reminder that which we keep from the light will destroy us, and that which we bring into the light will save us. And I've really come to believe that. And I went through my 20s where the only time I went, literally 10 years, where the only time I cried was at my grandmother's funeral. And I almost wore that as a badge of honor throughout my 20s, that like, look what I don't even know what I thought, but like, well, that I had my shit together, right? That's why when in actuality, it was a shit show, is what it was. And it is so freeing, to your point, Tim, to start to flip that on its head. I'm interested in, given how much the two of you talk about this stuff on social media, and how social media tends to be, or can have a tendency to be toxic, or think when you ask internet strangers for their opinions, they're going to give them to you. Have you run into a lot of pushback, or a lot of, say, sort of throwback of things like that post I started the conversation with? Or do you find that it's all like the people who step up and talk to you are almost entirely people who what you're saying resonates with?
I think on LinkedIn, not really. It's usually pretty positive. I've had some stuff on like YouTube Shorts or Instagram. But what I do get pushback on, or if you want to call them negative comments or whatever, on LinkedIn, is more when I post something about that has to do with taking responsibility, and in how, whether I remember making a post about the healthcare industry, and really what it's designed to treat sickness and not help you get well and stay ahead of the curve and be preventative. And some guy thought, I was fear mongering about, going to see a doctor or something. Or there's things like that, like with mental health, taking control of your mental health and how it's your responsibility and nothing outside of you is going to make that change for you. It's all on you. And so I think, to Jaleel's point earlier, it's freeing, or it's at first scary, right? But ultimately it's freeing. And I think what I run into is the people that are going up, hearing it for the first time and are still a little bit scared about that idea or push back against it. So that's really what I see, especially on LinkedIn.
Yeah, I haven't seen much negativity. And I think that is unique to LinkedIn. I was pretty active on Instagram for a while, and I personally just pulled back from it just because what I could see a lot of is just like this almost spiritual bypassing that was taking place. And like, what does that mean? It means like instead of doing the hard work of like going through the uncomfortable emotions of the fear and the anger and the pain and the sadness and the guilt and the shame and all the things that we've been talking about of like embracing the emotions, I was seeing a lot of people who were just like skipping past the mess and going into like, look at me, I'm well put together and I have all my things figured out, and like I did it because, or I was able to do it because. Whereas like I was tired of the highlight reel of like emotional well-being and wellness. I think that was the challenge that I was experiencing. I was actually on Instagram before I left for Florida, like posting poems about things that were like relatively challenging and like uncovering emotional realities and expressing like uncertainties and insecurities about myself. And I was just like being very intentional about sharing these things and just trying to get that fluid, that kind of like lubricant going, if you will. And I had a few people respond negatively to that. It scared them. I think that's what it was. And it freaked a lot of people out. They're like, wait, are you okay? Like, why are you talking about these things in public? Like, what are you doing? This doesn't make a lot of sense. Like, it's kind of freaking me out a little bit. Like, do you need someone? Do you need something? Like, do I need to call someone for you? So I think that there's almost like this mirror that I'd created for folks where I was holding something up and saying, hey, like this is what it's like to be a human being sometimes. And the reflection that people were getting back was actually really disconcerting for them. But I think that's probably the essence of the negativity I've experienced just from a social media perspective to date.
But when it comes to LinkedIn, I'm wondering why that might be, that and I've got my theories as to why it would be or a more supportive and encouraging space. But why do you have some sense of what's going on there? I mean,
I think
and I guess another word of framing is just that, given that it's a professional network, right, where this, and part of the premise of this show, it's like buttoned up, it's boring, it's a bunch of people trying to put themselves in the box of what we think the professional ideal is, right? And so this opportunity we have to step out of that, and the two of you who are doing such a good job of stepping into this very specific niche and need and talking to it with such clarity and such resonance, I could see how that might actually stoke some opposition, from that force, right? that is so pervasive. Yeah, Tim.
I think there's more accountability on LinkedIn, for one. I think people have obviously who they are, their real name, not just Brodog44 is their handle, and they have their company attached to it. So there's a bit of accountability there. And I think also if people are actively going on LinkedIn, this is definitely a hypothesis. This is just an assumption, I think. But if people are actively on LinkedIn, it's for different reasons than if you're, doom scrolling TikTok or Instagram. The content on LinkedIn is typically around performance, success, business, tips. Obviously it's changed. The climate on there has changed and there's more personal stories, which I think is great, but different than, things like entertainment or, sensationalizing, stories or events happening around the world that you get on other platforms. So I think that's at least, I've tried to think of it as well, like what makes people show up and not just, the trolls they definitely come out on LinkedIn, but just kind of different. Not as much, I would say. So those are the two things I tend to think of about why it's a little bit different, the interactions.
There's I don't even know which Superman it was. It might have been like the Man of Steel, but I remember at the end of the Man of Steel, there was like this narration that was happening where I think it was like maybe Superman's dad, or I can't remember exactly who, but he was saying something like, you will be an ideal that people will strive for, and they will fall and they will fail. But this idea of having something that people can look to work toward is what's going to keep people moving and keep people motivated. And I think of LinkedIn almost as that place where people are looking to create an ideal of themselves, and that ideal version of themselves, I think, calls almost Tim mentioned accountability. I think that's 100% accurate, right? But it creates this sense of like, I want to be my best self here, right? I want to pull the ideal version of myself out of myself. And I think that's the gift of it once being this buttoned up place where like we only show our professional setting. And now that there's like personal aspects to this that we're calling out, it almost creates this polarity map, right? Where we're like weaving together these two poles of like personal and professional, and it's creating the ideal version of someone as they show up on LinkedIn. And I've heard it, right? I personally haven't, but I've heard from other people like, hey, now this is turning into Facebook, like people like you that's making LinkedIn more like Facebook. And I personally haven't bumped into it, but I think that's the resistance, right, to that personal aspect and people wanting to maintain that like professional sense. But it's those poles. It's that like professionally buttoned up, never really let anybody into your personal life. And then there's that personal and showing up as a human being, and then weaving those two worlds together is, I think, how we're able to create a community, at least so far, that feels like it's looking to be the highest version of itself.
That's really well said. I had a post. It's the closest thing I've had to viral. I don't know if it counted, but it was about 12 lessons I've learned in the 12 years since my last drink. It's the only post on which I've actually gotten outright negative response, and it was from one gentleman who responded with Facebook though, and I looked at his profile, and his most recent post was a picture of him drinking wine in the middle of the afternoon. I was like, that's cute. Yeah, it's like, it's that thing that it seemed that just a perfect distillation of that idea that when we see that sort of thing, it seems like it's more a reflection of where that person is than it is on what we're saying. But Tim, I know you've got a hard stop here. Jaleel, could I talk you into hanging out for a few more minutes?
I can hang.
Cool. So obviously I'm going to be including LinkedIn profiles in the show notes. Tim, is there anywhere else you want to point people toward where they could find you?
Website, perwellness.com or perwellness.co. There's no M.
Right on.
And I just launched a men's group that's free at the moment. If people want to join, have more conversations, work on goals, articulate goals, actually, write them down, show up for accountability calls, talk to us about progress you're making, what's struggling, what you're struggling with, what's getting in your way, and we can, help you work through that. So
Cool.
hoping to move the needle a little bit with some guys.
Right on. Well, thank you very much for being here, Tim. It was a pleasure to meet you and get a chance to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. Thanks for having me. Likewise, and Jaleel, good to see you, man.
Good to see you too,
I'll
brother.
talk to you
It's always
soon.
a pleasure.
All right, later.
All right, see you guys.
So this is the second episode where somebody just leaves and then we just keep rolling.
I love it.
I'm not going to keep you as long as I kept Tara, where I think we rolled for another half hour. But I wanted to zero in on what you're doing with Breathe, Rise, and Thrive, because my angle on that is wanting to unpack for, say, specifically a person who's on LinkedIn and thinking about starting a side hustle or a project, and seeing how to basically take an idea and turn it into something. It's cool to see what you're building there. And yeah, I just wanted to unpack that a little bit and kind of going back to when you started that, how it started, and what it's grown into.
Yeah. Would love to have that conversation, Tony. I appreciate the opportunity. Yeah, so BRT was founded in July of 2020. I was still working at Google at the time, or I was on my way out. And really the idea was born from what I was kind of experiencing, in my corporate environment where, July of 2020, the context of the world was we're in the middle of this pandemic. We don't really have any answers yet. Everyone is very uncertain and there's a lot of fear. And the murder of George Floyd had just taken place. And there were protests in the streets and there were a lot of people who were angry. And what I was seeing in my everyday conversations with, founders of companies was like, hey, I can't even pay my employees, let alone pay for this product. I can't, there's nothing I can do right now. I had to lay off my entire workforce. And I had that conversation within this context probably 15, 20 times. It was painful. It was painful to hear that over and over again. And what I was discovering, and mind you, this is like after I'd gone to treatment and I'm like in this in this integration phase that's taking place for me. About a year or so after, about a year? Yeah, it was about a year or so after I'd left treatment at this point. And I'm in this integration process and I'm more emotionally aware and I'm hearing all of this pain. I was just seeing another person on the other side of this conversation, devoid of the business conversation. There were people that were in pain. There were people that were angry. There were people that were sad. There was a lot of guilt. There was shame in the conversation. And there was nothing I could do about it in that moment because of my professional obligation. My job was to try to get these people to pay us. And after some soul searching, I decided, you know what, I think it's time for me to take a step away from the corporate aspect of this and focus on what I'm hearing, which is human beings that are hurting. And at this point, I've been doing some coaching on the side. I had a mindfulness practice that was 13 years long and finally figured out how to keep it in orbit. I had a breathwork practice that quite literally had transformed my entire life and cleared me of all the wreckage of the pain and the traumas and relative dysfunction that I had been carrying in my body for so long. And in that original breathwork practice, I literally, Tony, was having flashback memories of 3-year-old me having conversations with my dad and rewiring myself and expressing anger that I wanted to express as a 3-year-old, but didn't have a place for it, didn't know how to express it, had no idea what I was feeling, erupt out of me in ways that was incredibly cleansing. It was the most cathartic experience I've ever had in my life. And so that breathwork practice, that moment that I had that experience, is you know what, I'm gonna teach this to people. I'm gonna figure out how I can teach this to people. And so, fast forward a year later, I decide, you know what, it's time for me to take a step away. And I had these tools that I had learned literally in the shittiest part of my life. I was forced to sit in my shit, no cell phone access, no internet access, no TV, no nothing, just sit in my shit at this recovery center. And that's what everyone was doing in the world. We were all sheltering in place, sitting in our shit at home, distracted, not able to distract ourselves with the things that we typically did, going to the gym, going to get drinks, going out with friends, going on holidays. None of that was available to folks anymore. And it just hit me like, I have tools that can help people right now. And so the first original kind of campaign was an invitation to pause. I pieced together a video, my co-founder and I, just speaking into the camera, very close up, like a cell phone, handheld selfie camera view, and an invitation to consider what it might be to just pause long enough to feel the shit that we are experiencing today. And we highlighted the context of the world, which we didn't have to, but like it was important. Hey, there's a lot of things going on right now. And instead of us rushing to a solution or rushing to blame or rushing to anger or whatever it is, like, what if we just sat in this long enough to understand what it meant for us as human beings in the world today, as literally the entire world is on pause? I invite you to take a moment to pause. And we had 35 people or so show up to that first breathwork session. And that was affirming that there was something here. People wanted something. And so you ask the question of like, how would somebody start? Like, take a risk, put some shit out in the world, invite people to it, and then allow for that to inform how you continue to show up. And so the BRT we've iterated on it a number of times. That original class led to us creating a digital workshop or a digital studio, where people would come in and take classes on a regular basis, and they pay a subscription fee to have access to those classes. Then that turned into speaking opportunities because the people that came to those classes were, married to or were founders of or knew someone in, and then they would connect us to this organization, and we started doing corporate wellness practices. And I work with organizations, all throughout the United States to create workshops for people, because these HR leaders were like, my people are struggling. I don't know what to do. How can I support them? And we offered them a solution. Let's do some meditation together. Let's do some breath work together. Let's create some wellness experiences for these folks. And it just continued that way. I was just constantly iterating on it and constantly taking the feedback. And now I teach workshops in Napa and Sonoma. I teach workshops in San Francisco. I have a workshop here in Santa Cruz next Saturday. And I also speak like virtually. I speak in person. It's just like, I think there's something beautiful. And this is, I think, really the essence of LinkedIn too, is when you put yourself out there and you put value out in the world and say like, I want to give this, I want to offer this to you, and I have no expectations for anything in return. I just want to give this to you. Something beautiful happens where people start to give you feedback, and you listen to that feedback, and maybe it's actual feedback, maybe it's they purchase your product, maybe it's like, hey, I have no interest in that. And all of that begins to inform how I show up. And I just take those pieces and I continue to iterate. So now, like, the new iteration of BRT is we have a community. People pay a subscription fee to be a part of that community. That community consists of people from all over the globe, and they can like talk to each other in between sessions. And there's this async communication that takes place. There's courses that are available in there. There's those actual classes that we still teach Wednesdays, Fridays, and Sundays. And now people are asking me to teach them how to teach. Right? They want me to teach them how to teach the classes I've been teaching them, and they've been in the program now for 2 years or so. And so now that's the new iteration. It's like, okay, now I'm training the trainer. Now I'm creating programs where I'm teaching people how to do things I've been doing for the last couple of years.
And when you started doing that, did you have in mind that you wanted to start a business around it? Was it, no?
Not at all. No.
Yeah. But at this point, it's great. And I won't ask you to pull back the kimono entirely, but at this point, it is a side hustle where you're getting part of your income from it.
Getting part of my income from it. Yeah.
Do you have intentions of growing it? Like, you're going to keep, I mean, it sounds like you're going to keep doing it and keep seeing where those iterations go, but do you have aspirations for what it might become?
Yeah. So before I came back into the corporate world, I wanted it to be my entire income, right? And I had runway that came from an acquisition, and so I was comfortable financially for a period where I didn't have to make money for me to be able to live and for my family to be comfortable, which I'm grateful for and truly is a blessing and something that not everyone has, and I it was a privilege of mine, and I'm grateful I had it. And it in that period of time, my goal was to generate livable income from this for a long period of time.
Did you
And
succeed?
I did not succeed. No. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I that's why I came back to the corporate world. Was there was a combination of things. It was if we wanted to stay in California and continue to live where we were living, I was going to have to make more money. My wife was growing very uncomfortable with like the current status and where things were moving, and I had to go back, and we kind of talked about this idea of a provider, right? I had to go back to the reality that like there is a responsibility that I have. I brought a child into this world, and I married this woman, and I have committed to these folks to make sure that I can do everything in my power to ensure that they have a comfortable life. And that is, for me, that feels like an opportunity, not an obligation. And I was not fulfilling that opportunity when the feedback from my wife became, hey, I'm feeling really uncomfortable. This is not working out for me. And I'd given it a long run. I gave it from July of 2020. I didn't start working at my current job until November of 2021. So it was over a year and like 3 months or so. So yeah, I didn't succeed. I think I almost, not almost, I know I did. I intentionally didn't put this on like a fast track because it almost felt like I wanted to see what would happen if I allowed for this community to be organic. Was that the right decision? I don't know, right? I don't think I ever will. You have a question? Go ahead.
No, what you're doing sounds along the lines of some of the stuff I've been doing in the creativity space over the last 6 years. And I too have had ideas for how it could become like the thing. And I'm fascinated by the potential of the creator economy, right? And where, like I could take my, understanding of the creative process and passion for that and help people work through their process and build it and come up with ways to, provide services or provide products or provide community. We've got the Rowdy Creative, and you doing that with the mindfulness and the breath work. And where I've come to at this point is just, we have to have the body of work. Like that body of work must exist before you're going to get to the point where you have a hope of being able to sustain yourself or your family with it. And I've come to believe that it takes a really long time for most of us to do that. And it's really hard to, particularly when we're talking about things that maybe start out as passion projects. Like it certainly started that way for me. Sounds like it started that way for you. Something that is off the beaten path from all the hoops we jump through to become the provider and the successful man in the first place, right? That like, when it's like, I wonder what we can do with creativity. I wonder what we could do with breath work. That's like, we're off the conventional path and we are blazing our own trails, or we are finding our own way through let's say a far less trodden path, right? Where we're figuring it all out on the fly. So it just like I say all that to say that when I see what you're doing now and how you continue to iterate and continue to grow as an entrepreneur and frankly as a practitioner, right? As somebody who knows what you're talking about. Like your potential for becoming that guy, and maybe you don't want to, right? Maybe you are thrilled with the trajectory you're on, and you're in a great situation. Maybe you want that to continue for another 10 years. But it's like, because of all the work you've put in over the last, well, frankly, 12 years or whatever, but then specifically these last 2, you're in a better position today than you were 6 months ago, 12 months ago, 18 months ago, to actually manifest that in a way that it might work. Maybe.
Yeah. I appreciate that, Tony. I truly do. And I appreciate the vote of confidence, and just hearing you reflect back to me, it's affirming, and also creates clarity for me, right? Of like, okay, this is the like, I know who I show up as, at least in my understanding of self. I know how I show up, but like, how am I received is always like a question for me. I think it's a blind spot that I have, is like, what I'm putting out in the world, how is it being received? And so hearing a reflection is really, it helps me kind of fill in that blank spot. So thank you for that. And I think it's an interesting place. I very much so have a conviction that we talked about, like being, a man of color, and like, having this curly hair, and like still showing up in this professional setting in this conversation. I have like this conviction that I have a unique opportunity to be someone that looks like me, that comes from the world that I come from, that, my father was incarcerated for 10 years. Like, my mother was on welfare. Like, she struggled with alcoholism. Like, I have friends who are drug dealers and or dead. Like, I come from this place that many people hear about in rap music or TV or see on TV, and think like there's a specific kind of like outcome that they're expecting for that person. And for me to step into the world from this place of peace and joy and contentment, and with a smile on my face, and choosing to be emotionally aware, in itself is a peaceful protest in a lot of ways. And I have this unique opportunity, I think, to just as a result of like who I was born to and how I live my life. I didn't do it myself. It's not mine. It just happens to be the thing that I have. I have a unique opportunity to help rewrite, I think, a lot of narratives for folks. And, I've even shared things about visiting a family member in prison, and like how consider these other aspects of life that take place outside of our 9 to 5, and how that might show up for somebody if they spent Saturday all day waiting in line to go visit their parent in prison. And then on Monday morning, they come to work and they're a little bit downtrodden. Like, why is that, right? Maybe they're feeling a little bit tired, overwhelmed, emotionally taxed. Like those narratives, I kind of fill in, I think, a lot of ways, the gaps that may exist in the professional world. So I'm sharing all this to say, like, I don't actually know, right, what it is that I am here to do. I don't quite really have like a firm grip on it, but what I sense is an opportunity. And I very much so want, the work that I do every day as a practitioner and as a speaker and as a leader to be the only thing I do, right? Like, I want that to be my thing. It's like how I show up in the world. And that could also be, right, in part of someone's corporate environment. It could also be as a fully self-sustaining business, free of any sort of W-2, right? I think it's like, I'm worried about how this being shows up and how this being embodies the opportunity that's in front of me. And then within the context, we'll see how it goes. I don't know yet.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. And one of the things I'm finding so nourishing and frankly exciting about this journey of like creating stuff and starting businesses, and for both of us, it sounds like LinkedIn is tied in with it to some degree, is that recognition that we are becoming, and that's all the process is. And we're learning as we go. And as I get older, I get more and more comfortable with the idea that I have no idea what's going on.
Yeah.
Just working on stuff, trying to get better, trying to make stuff, put it in the world. And then, every once in a while you get to have that experience where you put something out and then it works. It's like, oh, I'll be damned. That worked. Cool. I want to be mindful of your time. Aside from your LinkedIn profile, is there anywhere else you want to direct people toward to learn more about you?
Yeah, I'm in the process currently of kind of rebuilding. So breathe, rise, and thrive.com is one place you can find me. And JaleelMackey.com is my own kind of space that I'm creating in the world, in the internet world, where you can find everything that I'm involved in. VRT is one piece of what I do, and JaleelMackey.com hopefully will encompass everything that I do, if I can find a way to make that work.
I hear you, man. TonyAlbright.me exists, and it's a work in progress on like having that digital hub of like, here's trying to contain the multitudes we contain in a single website. It gets real hairy in a hurry, doesn't it?
It sure does.
I feel that. And cool. Thank you for the time today, man. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise, brother. Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Another episode in the books. Thank you so much for listening. Again, you can check the show notes for the links to both LinkedIn profiles as well as perwellness.co and Jaleel Mackey's sites for Breathe, Rise, and Thrive, and also JaleelMackey.com. I should mention, I still have a book out in the creative arena. You can find it on Amazon. There's also a link in the show notes here. And if you wouldn't mind, if you've enjoyed these podcasts, a rating and review on Apple would be really wonderful. Thank you very much for your time, and I will see you out there in Lincoln Land.